Our species lives at an unprecedented point in the history of life on our planet. For the majority of the time that Homo sapiens have existed, we have not been the only human species alive, and yet, today, we are the only ones left. There was once a time, however, when our species coexisted with several others that we would likely have recognized as human when we encountered them, and yet also not quite. We interacted with these other species, interbred with them, perhaps competed with them, and then they were all gone. In 2015, another of these ancient human species was revealed to the world, a small-bodied, small-brained species known from a cave in South Africa. They were named Homo Naledi, and the cave they were found in was about to reveal all sorts of amazing new secrets about this species. Homo Naledi, named after the Sesotho word for star, is a fascinating species. Features of their anatomy puzzled researchers at first, with their combinations of traits that looked a lot like modern humans, but also many that resembled more ancient hominins such as the Australopithecines. The conditions of their discovery were also a source of intrigue, with the fossilized remains of at least 15 individuals being found upon their initial discovery and excavation, all in this single, highly inaccessible chamber deep within the cave system. Since 2015, much more research has been done on these hominins, and some truly mind-blowing discoveries have been made that seem to challenge a lot of what we previously thought about the complex subject of human evolution. Now though, another discovery about Homo naledi might just be the most astonishing one of all, as researchers claim that these small-brained, not quite human people were burying their dead and contemplating an afterlife. In this first video, we'll be taking a look at how Homo naledi was discovered and a lot of the incredible findings that have been made about its biology and potential behavioural capabilities in the years since. Then, in part 2, we'll have a look at the most recent and most controversial discoveries that seem to hint at the potential existence of fascinating cultural practices among these small-brained, archaic-looking humans. Now, I've actually been incredibly lucky to visit the cave in which Homo naledi was found, called the Rising Star Cave in the Cradle of Humankind, not far from Johannesburg. Doug and I were invited to South Africa in August of 2021, where we joined a team of paleontologists on an expedition into the Karoo semi-desert to search for much older fossils. But before we left on the expedition, we were able to go to the cradle. Here, we met two of the researchers and cavers who have been involved with the incredible Homo naledi discoveries, Dr. Kanelu Molopiane and Dirk van Rooyen. They very kindly took us down into the first chamber of the Rising Star cave system, where the base camp for the excavations had been set up, and showed us the entrance to the passageway that eventually leads you to the chamber in which Homo naledi was first discovered. This chamber, called the Lesedi Chamber, was found to contain hominin bones in 2013 by two cavers, who had been asked by the paleoanthropologist Professor Lee Berger to explore deeper into the system while they were excavating different hominins at a nearby locality. Soon after learning of the fossils in the chamber, Professor Berger assembled a team of underground astronauts, as he called them, 6 women who were able to pass through the terrifyingly narrow routes that led to the Lesedi Chamber. Maps of the cave system show quite how extreme the route is. Just getting to the Dragon's Back chamber is difficult enough, but then the access point into the Lesedi Chamber is incredibly challenging. This descent through a passage known as the Chute involves a 12-meter vertical climb down through openings as small as 20 centimeters, or about 8 inches. Extensive exploration of the chamber by professional cavers soon showed that there were no other ways of getting into the Lesedi Chamber, and there seems to be no evidence of an older, now collapsed entrance either, so Homo naledi would presumably have had to have passed this way too. The initial excavation of the chamber was carried out in a relatively short time period, in 2 expeditions. One in November of 2013, just over a month after the remains were first recognised, and another in March of 2014. The 15 individuals recovered in these initial excavations represent the largest accumulation of a single hominin species that has ever been found in Africa, and immediately there were questions about how exactly they had all got into this very difficult to access chamber. Homo naledi was a small species, standing at an average height of about 4'9", and parts of their anatomy seem to suggest they had adaptations for climbing. In a study that describes the hand bones of the species, it's said that the fingers are long and the bones are notably curved, suggesting they had a strong gripping capability useful for climbing and suspending themselves by their arms. However, the thumb is also robust and long, and the wrist anatomy is similar to that of Neanderthals and modern humans, all of which support the idea that Homo naledi was also capable of the precision handling necessary for tool use. Continuing this trend of mosaic, primitive, and more derived human-like features, Homo naledi was found to have an endocranial volume, relating to the brain size, that was notably small and similar to the smaller brains of older Australopithecines. But then the overall anatomy of the cranium is most similar to other early species of the Homo genus, such as Homo erectus. Then, while the anatomy of the shoulder region, trunk, pelvis, and upper legs are more Australopithecine, the lower legs and foot are much more like a modern human's. These conflicting combinations of traits found throughout the skeletons of Homo naledi led the researchers to conclude that they must be a relatively ancient member of the Homo lineage. And in the initial paper naming the species, they estimate an age for it of anywhere between 2 million years and just under 1 million years old. At this point, the deposits within the chamber that the remains had been found in had not yet been dated, and so just based on the anatomy of the skeletons, this date seemed like a reasonable approximation. Another paper published in 2016 using a different method of analysing Homo naledi's position among other hominins found an estimated age of 912,000 years old, which seemed to agree with these initial dates. But then in 2017, the deposits were dated. Using a combination of different approaches, including uranium-thorium dating, paleomagnetic analyses, and optically stimulated luminescence dating, they managed to constrain an age for these bones of between 335,000 and just 236,000 years old, far more recent than anyone had expected. So this was another pretty significant discovery. This anatomically archaic, small-brained hominin was living surprisingly late into the Pleistocene epoch. This also means that Homo naledi was coexisting with the earliest members of our own species, the oldest definite remains of which are known from about 300,000 years ago at a site in Morocco. In a related publication released at the same time in 2017, Lieberger and colleagues discuss what this revelation means for hominin evolution. Before the dating of Naledi, it had been thought that only modern humans or their close relatives, all with large brain sizes, had been living at this time in Africa. But it seems that Homo naledi represents a more ancient lineage that first appeared during an earlier stage of diversification and speciation within the Homo genus, and then survived through to these more recent times. The paleoanthropologists also point out that, taking into account this late survival, we should consider that some of the stone tool architecture found from around these times in South Africa might even have been constructed by this species, especially since their hand and wrist anatomy hints at a capacity for tool use. The discovery of a recent existence also has many interesting implications for the evolution of hominin brain size, since Homo naledi shows that there wasn't just a single apparent evolutionary trend towards larger brain volume sizes in later hominins. The conflicting anatomical traits have made it difficult to properly clarify the evolutionary position of this species though. The 2017 publication by Professor Berger and colleagues presents 3 potential placements for Homo naledi. Possibly it originated somewhere within the diversification of lineages leading to Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, Homo floresiensis, and Australopithecus sediba. Possibly it represents a sister group to the lineage leading to Homo erectus and larger-brained hominins such as Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and others. Or maybe Homo naledi is actually a branch of the lineage leading to our own species and other archaic humans. The problem with Naledi is that wherever it's placed among these lineages, there would have to have been a few evolutionary reversals or convergences to explain its mosaic anatomy. For example, if the first scenario is accepted, then the small brain size is the ancestral condition, and a larger brain size evolves later on along the branch leading to Homo sapiens. But then all those modern human-looking bits of skeletal anatomy in Naledi, such as the wrists, hand, lower limb, and foot, would have separately convergently evolved in both this species and the lineage leading to our own species. Alternatively, placing Homo naledi in a sister group to the lineage leading to Homo sapiens, scenario 3, means those modern human-like features could be explained as the result of common ancestry, but the smaller brain volume and all the other more primitive-like traits would have resulted from some kind of evolutionary reversal, or atavism. The thing is though, Homo naledi is actually not particularly unusual among hominins for all these confusing similarities between species. A lot of convergences do occur between archaic humans. But the fact that we have so much of the Homo naledi skeleton means that researchers have been able to see many more of them in this particular case. An obvious comparison that can be made with Homo naledi is with other relatively small-bodied members of the Homo genus. such as Homo floresiensis from Indonesia and Homo luzonensis from the Philippines. Homo floresiensis lived between 190,000 to 50,000 years ago and was actually even smaller bodied than the average for Naledi, with the height of one individual estimated at about 3 foot 6 inches, while luzonensis, living about 67,000 to 50,000 years ago, is based on some very fragmentary remains, and so a robust estimate cannot be obtained, but it's possible they stood somewhere between 4 foot 8 and 4 foot 11. Since both floresiensis and luzonensis were discovered on islands, this small body size has been hypothesized by many researchers to be the result of insular dwarfism, an evolutionary phenomenon in which larger animals become smaller over time in response to the more restricted environment and resources of an island habitat. Since Homo erectus is known to have made it to East Asia by about 2 million years ago, this species has been suggested as the ancestor of floresiensis, finding its way onto an island and then shrinking in size over time as they adapted to their new environment. However, the affinities of floresiensis have become a bit of a debate in recent years, with some researchers actually suggesting that they might just be a population of pathologic Homo sapiens, while others hypothesize that they could have originated from an even older African radiation within Homo. A study from 2017 put these different ideas to the test, constructing an expanded dataset of anatomical information and running it through phylogenetic analyses. The Homo sapiens with pathologies idea was ruled out completely, and the study also found no close relationship between floresiensis and erectus, instead supporting a position where floresiensis either shares a common ancestor with the more ancient Homo habilis, or is in a sister group to the group including Homo habilis, erectus, ergaster, and sapiens. So basically, because floresiensis actually has various more archaic anatomical traits in its skeleton, it probably split off the hominin family tree before Homo erectus, and in fact represents an even more ancient dispersal of members of the Homo genus out of Africa and across Asia. Homo luzonensis may also represent an example of this more ancient dispersal, since it also has a few features that resemble Australopithecine characters, but again the highly fragmentary nature of the remains makes it difficult to determine. All of this is to say that Homo floresiensis and luzonensis may not actually be examples of insular dwarfism in action, since if they evolved from a branch nearer to Homo habilis, then they would have evolved from an ancestor that already had a small body and brain size, considering that Homo habilis size estimates range from about 3 foot 3 to 4 foot 10. So this is something to think about when considering Naledi's position. If scenario 1 turns out to be where it should place, then perhaps Naledi evolved in the same radiation that gave rise to floresiensis and luzonensis. All of these small species then survived until relatively recent times, but Naledi is particularly unusual for remaining in Africa, whereas the lineage leading to floresiensis and luzonensis went for a very long walk. Another option for Homo naledi origins has also been discussed, the idea that these humans represent a lineage that arose from a hybridization event between a more derived human-like population and relict Australopithecines. This could explain the mosaic nature of their anatomy, and we do know that later human species couldn't keep it in their pants and definitely did a lot of hybridizing, but for the moment this hypothesis remains untestable since attempts to extract DNA from the bones of Homo naledi have been unsuccessful so far. This origination hypothesis isn't favoured as much as others though, as the simpler explanation is still that Naledi is just a survivor from an older point of human speciation, and there are some unique derived characteristics that may eventually help to solve its placement, but it's very interesting to think about. Also in 2017, it was announced that a second chamber containing Homo naledi bones had been discovered. This chamber is also within the Rising Star cave system and is known as the Lesedi Chamber. This section of the cave system is far away from the Dinaledi chamber with no direct route to it, and so it definitely represents a distinct, separate deposition of Homo naledi bodies. Based on how many duplicate bones were recovered, it seems there were at least 3 individuals in this chamber, 2 adults and a juvenile. However, the spacing between bones suggests that there was also likely more than only these 3 hominins here. 131 bones were identified from Lesedi in this publication, and the chamber itself is situated about 30 meters beneath the surface. A fairly complete skull was recovered from Lesedi of one of the adult individuals, which was a very significant find. It was nicknamed Neo, meaning gift in Sesotho. Not only is it almost completely preserved, but it actually extends the known range of endocranial volume for this species, being larger than the previously recovered crania from Naledi. It's still not approaching the upper range for Homo erectus, mind you, but it does overlap a bit more with their lower range, and it also puts the maximum known range for Naledi above the maximum for any Australopithecine found so far. The depositional situation in Lesedi Chamber again seems to be quite similar to the one in Naledi. No other hominin species are present, there's no evidence for a single catastrophic event that led to them all being buried here, and there are no signs of being fed on, meaning they probably weren't dragged in here by predators. And therein lies one of the most controversial aspects of the Homo Naledi story. Just how exactly did these hominins end up in such abundance in these remote cave chambers? Well, right from the beginning, Professor Berger and colleagues suspected that Naledi was potentially using this cave system as a place for deliberate body disposal. When the species was announced to the world in 2015, one of the series of studies that were published at this time was an investigation of the geology and taphonomic context of the Naledi chamber, basically looking at how these bones came to be here and the setting they were found in. Firstly, this research revealed that the burial history of the Naledi remains was quite complex, with reworking of the bones having occurred as the cave floor was gradually eroding and slumping. However, all this reworking had taken place entirely within the chamber, and there was no evidence that the bones had ever been exposed to the Earth's surface and the elements, with limited weathering indicative of a water-saturated and dark environment, and not weathering from exposure to the sun and rain. So, the bodies had made it here intact. Secondly, there was evidence of more than one period of deposition, meaning the bones did not get preserved here all at once, and there was a significant period of time over which the bodies were coming here. Another fascinating discovery is that there was no evidence of significant trauma on the bones that occurred just before or after death, and there were no cut marks, bite marks, or other clear indications of predation, or potentially cannibalism, as has been discovered at other hominin sites. Coupled with the very notable absence of any other large vertebrate remains in the chamber, it seems that transport by predators into a den can also be ruled out as an explanation. The study also does not find any evidence suggesting that the bodies were all transported by some kind of catastrophic event, such as a flood. The chamber appears to have been a closed system since the time of Naledi, and the accumulation of sediment there is very fine-grained, as it's coming in through cracks in the cave and therefore filtering out larger grains. A flooding event, however, would transport much larger grains along with the hominin bones, and that's not what they're finding. The idea that the chamber was occupied by the hominins over an extended period of time was also considered. However, there is a lack of evidence for such longer-term occupation in this part of the system, with no so-called occupation debris located, and the incredibly challenging accessibility of the chamber makes it seem like a fairly unlikely option. So, having ruled out predator accumulation, transport by water, and long-term occupation, the deliberate body disposal hypothesis was concluded to be the most parsimonious explanation, at least based on the evidence they had from the context of the cave. The researchers proposed that the Homo Naledi bones had ended up here because they were carried through the system and either placed or perhaps dropped through an entrance into the chamber. It's also important to remember that the Naledi chamber is about 30 meters underground, and there are no indications of a direct vertical route from the surface into the chamber having ever existed. Nor was there a direct vertical route into the Dragon's Back chamber. So, although the cave certainly would have looked different during Naledi's time as geological processes changed it, they would still have had to make a challenging journey through narrow passages underground to get there, which raises another very intriguing implication. How were these hominins seeing in the dark to navigate the cave system? There's really only one explanation: the utilization of fire, and that's something we'll come back to in part 2. No direct vertical route into the chamber also rules out the possibility that the accumulation represents a natural death trap for hominins that fell in, which are known for other species. Of course, the evidence presented by Berger and colleagues that Homo Naledi was using the Naledi chamber as a place to dispose of bodies, and the inherent implication that these hominins were perhaps contemplating the nature of death and engaging in very complex, very human social responses to the passing of other members of their group, prompted a good deal of skepticism from other scientists. Not that this was undeserving, of course, as it's a pretty significant thing to suggest that appears to challenge some of the previous ideas about human evolution, and specifically the concept that only larger-brained hominins could be capable of such behaviours. Plus, some felt that the other explanations for the accumulation of Homo naledi bones in the chamber hadn't yet been fully tested and disproven, and I think that's a fair response. It's always best to thoroughly test a null hypothesis until it's definitely disproven, before then accepting the alternative. One of these responses was published in 2016, when a researcher at the Evolutionary Studies Institute in Johannesburg critiqued some of the conclusions made by the paper investigating the context of the Naledi bones. They say that the major question that still needs answering before the body disposal hypothesis can be accepted is if there was, at some point in the past, another entrance into the chamber. Although the only large vertebrate fossils in the chamber are those of Naledi, there are some very small rodent and bird bones that have been recovered, hinting that maybe there was once another way into the chamber. Though, to be fair, such small vertebrates could probably also have found their way in through the long underground route, so I'm not sure that's the best argument, but still something to consider. The 2016 paper does point out that the presence of microscopic damage to the Naledi bones can be attributed to the action of certain invertebrate groups. Specifically, the damage looks similar to that caused by beetles and snails. However, the specific snails suggested as potential candidates for the causes of the damage are today not known to live in underground cave chambers. Plus, the fact that the damage is present on the bone surfaces of the Naledi fossils implies that the invertebrates must have been feeding on the bodies after some decay had already occurred, exposing the bones. So they use this as a line of evidence suggesting that the bodies must have decayed to a certain extent, either on the surface or in a region of the cave system near the surface, where the snails could reach them. Then the paper suggests the bodies were transported deeper into the cave system. Again though, it's not necessarily evidence against deliberate body disposal, but it might suggest that perhaps the bodies were not particularly freshly deceased when they were taken into these deeper parts. The study also implies that transport by water flow should still be considered as a valid hypothesis for the movement of the bodies through the cave, suggesting that the patterns of which Naledi bones were preserved in articulation are consistent with the natural mummification of the bodies, and that these mummies could then have been washed from elsewhere into the Naledi chamber. So definitely some valid criticisms and alternatives to consider. But all things considered, it doesn't seem like quite enough to completely disprove body disposal outright. And there were about to be some even more discoveries from Rising Star that seemed to strengthen the case for deliberate body disposal even more. A reply to the 2016 paper was published soon after by the lead author of the geology paper, Paul Dirks, along with Lee Berger and colleagues, explaining that they actually had not entirely rejected alternate explanations for the Naledi accumulation, but simply found the most plausible explanation to be the deliberate disposal of bodies. The reply then goes through and responds to each of the criticisms raised, starting with the argument that there may have been another more direct entrance into the Naledi chamber in the past. Mapping of the chamber roof shows that it's capped by a more than a meter thick bed of chert that forms a continuous layer not broken by large shafts that might have once led to the surface. And surface mapping and geophysical evidence does not suggest the presence of any other large openings between the chamber and the Earth's surface. Evidence from the sedimentology of the cave system also shows that the Naledi chamber is an almost completely isolated area, even from the rest of the cave. The Dragon's Back chamber is the deepest part that sediment would be able to travel into through the flow of water along the floor. But then the entrance to Naledi is blocked off by the Dragon's Back itself, a massive block of fallen dolomite that has to be climbed up before descending the chute. It also turns out that the sedimentological layers containing the other small fossil remains of birds and rodents are separate and older than the younger layers containing the bones of Naledi, and they were transported from higher up in the chamber along ledges, but were not transported by water flow along the floor. Again, the reply reinforces that there is no sedimentological evidence supporting high energy water flows into Naledi that would be enough to transport the Homo Naledi bodies, and that the chamber was an isolated environment, even at the time of Naledi. They also refute the argument that the invertebrate damage to the bones could only have been inflicted by surface-dwelling snails, as they actually didn't suggest that the specific surface-dwelling species cited by the 2016 paper were the cause of the damage. They were simply using the experimental data from these species to show that the damage had been done by the mouthparts of some sort of snail. In fact, subterranean snails have been found in other deep parts of the Rising Star cave system, and beetles and their larvae are also known from such environments. So it was argued that it's entirely possible the invertebrate damage to the bones was done within the chamber. The reply also refutes a few more of the 2016 paper's claims, essentially ending with saying again there is no sedimentological evidence supporting transport by water flow, and that there is no evidence for accumulation by a carnivore, which the 2016 paper had also argued evidence for. But that wasn't the only published criticism these Naledi interpretations got. In 2018, after the remains had been dated and the Lesedi Chamber finds announced to the world, another group of paleoanthropologists published a paper applying machine learning techniques to the Naledi Chamber, as well as another purported early hominin burial site, Cima de los Huesos, in Spain, where Homo heidelbergensis or early Neanderthal skeletons have been found. The results of this study again found that the alternative explanations for the accumulation of hominins in both instances can't be fully ruled out. But, as in the 2016 paper, also didn't present any evidence that would fully falsify the deliberate body disposal hypothesis. So again, not particularly good support for it, but also not saying that it definitely can't have been deliberate body disposal. Another very interesting study was published in 2018 looking at the brain anatomy of Homo naledi, with some intriguing results. This is another aspect of the whole body disposal issue that's important to investigate, since understanding how the brains of these hominins may have worked allows new insights into the potential likelihood of what sorts of behaviours they might have been capable of. Based on the fragments of crania that had been found from Homo naledi, sections of the brains of these hominins could be reconstructed by creating digital endocasts. That is, reconstructing the external shape and anatomy of the brain by looking at the insides of the cranial bones and the imprints left on them. Comparing these partial endocasts to the brains of modern humans, other extinct hominins, and modern chimpanzees, they found some very interesting similarities between the brains of all members of the Homo genus, including Naledi. Despite having a significantly smaller brain volume than some other members of Homo, Naledi seems to have possessed features of the brain anatomy that have been associated with the development of motor functions possibly to do with tool use, as well as the production of speech, though the exact details are contentious. Other shared features among all examined Homo brains include areas associated with the processing of language, producing and recognizing social emotions, learning emotions, and social inhibition. So, based on these results, it would seem that all members of the Homo lineage, even including the small-brained Naledi, were capable of planning and performing complex sequences of actions such as creating tools, communicating extensively with conspecifics, and having an increased display of emotions within a social context. And really, it probably shouldn't be so much of a surprise when we know that modern non-human primates, such as chimpanzees, are capable of similar things too, but not to the same extent. And here we're talking about species that are far closer to our own than to chimps. So some really fascinating results from that study, which also explain that an increase in brain size is not the only thing we need to consider. Brain organization is also important in figuring out what sorts of behaviors this ancient human species might have been capable of. The Naledi Chamber really is the gift that keeps on giving, and in 2021, Lee Berger and colleagues, led by paleoanthropologist Juliet Brophy, published another study announcing their discovery of even more Homo naledi material from the chamber. This material was found in a different place within the cave, however, 12 meters away from where the original excavations took place, within a very narrow fissure leading off from an adjoining section of the system nicknamed the Chaos Chamber. This remote section of the cave was incredibly cramped, measuring just 15 centimeters or about 6 inches wide, but within it, there was the skull of a child. This child was nicknamed Leti, coming from the Setswana word Letimela, meaning lost one. The skull is far from complete, comprising 6 teeth and 28 fragments of the cranium, but the pieces are definitely all from the same individual, and yet again it raises some very interesting questions. How did this child come to be in this narrow, difficult to access location within the subsystem? How come the skull pieces were found on a limestone ledge raised above the cave floor? Was it placed here by other Homo naledi individuals? Was there some sort of significance to this particular child that prompted it to be buried away from the others? Perhaps that's getting a little ahead of things, but it does make you wonder. If these bones really do represent body disposal, then the difference with the placement of Leti is very intriguing. But this is really only the beginning of the Homo naledi story. There's so much more to cover, and some truly mind-blowing discoveries have been made in Rising Star that have only very recently been published, but have also caused a great deal of controversy and debate among paleoanthropologists. including possible stone tools that were buried with Naledi children, and even cave engravings. And that's what we'll be looking at in part 2. I did want to include all of this in one video, but the story of Naledi is so interesting and there's so much to talk about that to get these videos done in time I've had to split them up. But it won't be too long before I get to the next part. Hopefully you've enjoyed learning about this incredible human species so far, and I would like to again thank Dr. Kanelu Molipiane and Dirk van Rooyen for taking us into the caves and for being such fantastic guides when we visited a couple of years ago, and to Professor Lee Berger for allowing us to visit. And of course also to Dr. Julian Benoit for inviting us to South Africa in the first place and being a wonderful host. Also thank you to Aliénor Duhamel for taking us to the cradle, and to my friend Quinn Arden-True for checking the script for this video for me. If you would like to watch our adventure into the Rising Star cave system while you wait for part 2, you can. It's called How the Cradle of Humankind Reveals the Answers to Human Evolution, and it'll be linked below. Anyway, thank you for watching, and a big thank you to our Patreon supporters, especially our Dinosaur tier supporters, Amanda von Nordek, Archienthus, Clara Middleton, Daniel Ingraham, Dhruv Srivastava, Gary Arrington, Giortist, Greg Silvernail, Corey Peterson, Loxypoo, Mark Nevin, Mendicant Fryer, Mike Pace, Monitor Man, Persian Boy, Ralph Balzac, Robert Thomas, and Steve Bradshaw. If you would like to find out more about our world, its history, and the wonderful life that surrounds us all, please feel free to subscribe to the channel if you think we deserve it, and if you would like to see more from us.